We turn to Rowan Douglas from Willis Re, who chaired the session on insurance and climate change.
Many thanks indeed. I think some of the speakers earlier this morning described how important it was for sectors which were related to sort of explore opportunities, and also perhaps for the impact assessment community to reach out to other worlds. And I think that's certainly something we all achieved in the last session. The insurance sector, and thank you to my 5 colleagues who came, certainly reached out with energy following Will's kind invitation. And the selective, but dare I say it, high quality community from the impact assessment world certainly seemed to embrace us warmly. And there's 2 or 3 themes that I think really emerged from our session. The first is that there's an enormous amount of science and research that's being supported and funded by the insurance world, which has very direct implications for the impact assessment community, and indeed could be consumed by that community. So my colleague Deborah Ballon from the Institute of Building and Home Safety demonstrated a new facility that they've launched with the support of the market of $40 million worth of laboratory which tests buildings and other structures against wind and other perils. Enormous value in the outputs of that to help in the development of building codes or better procedures. And that theme was amplified by Chris Johnson of FM Global, a leading insurance company, who amplified those issues around research and development, but also how relatively simple interventions in terms of improved building techniques had massive improvements on the performance of structures, reduction of losses, and protection of life. My colleague Rick Hawkenbury from Willis amplified those themes and demonstrated how losses from property insurance and over the last 10 to 20 years was raising the temperature, if I can use a terrible metaphor, in our market, but also how the litigation temperature is rising too, and both these forces are going to create important impacts, which led very neatly to Lindeen Patton, who has a rather unusual but increasingly influential title. She's the Chief Climate Products Officer at Zurich Insurance, one of the world's largest. And she demonstrated very clearly how over the last 120 years, the insurance sector has acted as a powerful agent of social and political change around safety, and how our challenge of usually protecting private assets has to be integrated with the needs of developing public policy. It's very clear that through a variety of mechanisms, not least the pricing mechanism, that we hope that we'll be able to improve both mitigation, risk management, but also adaptation influences. And finally, delighted that probably from upstairs somewhere, Francis Guesquière from the World Bank could join us, was really highlighting how insurance-based science, as well as insurance-based techniques, were going to be a driving force in helping the protection of less developed communities around the world. So I think the final view, and we didn't have enough time for discussion, unfortunately. We had a very brief time to my IAIA colleagues, was that there was some real opportunities for fusion, and perhaps through the modelled world, which we must be masters of rather than servants, following Courtney's talk this morning, there are new supply chains emerging in our sector that links with yours, and we've got to find those and make them very hard and tangible. So apologies for overstepping my time, but we really enjoyed coming, and thank you for having us.
Thank you, Rowan, very much. You didn't overstep your time. Perfect. Now to Alistair Clark, who didn't actually chair a session, but he was in a session, and the one on multilateral development banks, the emerging standards there. And Alistair, since he didn't get introduced last time, he is Director of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development's Environment Department.
Thank you very much. I'm a living example of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Having to bump into Steve, and he said, "Oh, you will summarise this, won't you?" Anyway, so our session was really focusing on the international financial institutions who have a very important role not only in the development of policies, but they also are the providers of finance whether it be for mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and between us, we have a sort of a leadership role in actually being the spearhead by which the commercial world can follow us. So we started with a strategic overview from Alan Miller from the IFC. He said that his job was made very easy because he followed Bob's talk in the morning. So he really explained about some of the science, some of the tools that IFC were developing. But one area that was probably we're all waiting for a little bit more is what will be the climate change initiatives presented in the IFC policy update. So I think that's something that is still to come. Each of the institutions explained their individual initiatives and characteristics in the regions which they worked in. One of the conclusions was that ESIAs are an incredibly important decision-making tool, but they're not the only tool. And there are many other aspects of tools that we utilize that each of us are using. We had some excellent questions, one of which that we didn't really answer at all from Richenda, which was on the social development outcomes from adaptation, and maybe that's a subject for an offline discussion over a cocktail. That we also had some very good comments on harmonization of policies and standards from each of the individual institutions. And I think it was Janine who made the point is that it wasn't so much about harmonization, but where each of us are learning off each other. Each of us are developing pilot projects that can be directly utilized by other institutions. And so we're in the process of actually sort of leapfrogging over each other at the moment. My personal view is the quality of the debate that we're having now has moved considerably from where it was 2 years ago. So we've moved away from talking about the generalities of climate change to the specifics of what we should be doing. And I think that's really, for me, a fundamental theme of today's discussions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Now last, but certainly not least, Richenda Connell from Acclimatise, and she chaired part 2 of the session on tools, methods and information resources.
Thank you very much. So we had 4 presenters in our session as well, and they were talking about quite a broad set of things. They weren't sort of terribly related, but I suppose the themes were that we had 2 new information resources, both produced by the World Bank. One of them presented by Rafiq Hirji on environmental flows in water resources, policies, plans and projects, and another by Poonam Pillai on climate risk and adaptation in Asian coastal megacities. In both of these, the strong theme, which I think resonates with some of the points that have been made earlier on, was that they both used a lot of work on case studies to be able to understand the issues that they were looking at. And so in the case of Rafiq's work, they looked at case studies of environmental flows across Africa, Europe and Asia. And the conclusion from that was the roles of high-level policy in setting the right framework for plans and projects to be implemented successfully was absolutely essential. And in Poonam's case, the case studies that she did in Asia all demonstrated that many of the actions that cities were taking at the moment to deal with flood risk, which was the big issue she looked at, are not going to be sufficient in the future with climate change, and that there needed to be a lot more coordinated action by city planners if they were to bring about successful transformations of urban areas in the face of these challenges. And she specifically flagged up that her work had demonstrated that the areas of the cities where the poorer people lived were much more likely to be flooded. So those are 2 great new information resources, both of which are available from the World Bank, which I would recommend to you. The other 2 presenters then, we had Emmanuel Boulet from IDB talking about their new approach to assessing greenhouse gas emissions as part of EIAs for coal-fired power plants. And then we had Tobias Contreras from Mexico talking about work they've been doing at retrofitting low-income houses in Mexico PVs and also to improve their thermal performance. And both of these, for me, were nice examples of a point that Bob Watson made this morning, which is, in reality, we're not short of knowledge, we're short of action. And what we saw from IDB was that they talked about having taken a very difficult action of turning down funding a coal-fired power station which hadn't complied with their new requirements. And I think it was a tough decision and a tough thing to stick by, but it's an example of really sticking by the principles that you've set down. And then in terms of action that we heard about from Tobias from Mexico, the work that he's done in terms of retrofitting homes with PVs, and it's also helping to improve their thermal performance, as I said. So the overheating agenda, the adaptation agenda is a fantastic success story by the sounds of it. What I found very interesting there the first time I heard this was the use of mortgages as an instrument for bringing about successful action on climate change. The mortgages were being used to contain the costs of these PVs and these measures. So both cases where action by both of these groups was making a real difference. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Richenda, very much indeed.